She was 21 and had just been thrown out. Not with cruelty, not with a fight, just a quiet conversation at the kitchen table of her aunt's small house on a Tuesday evening in January, in which her aunt had explained, in the careful, measured voice of a woman who had spent 40 years as a school librarian, and who therefore knew how to deliver bad news without raising her own blood pressure, that the house was being sold. The assisted living facility in Rhinelander had accepted her aunt's application. The house would close at the end of the month, and with $10 in the canvas tool roll her grandfather had left her, she bought a crumbling commercial ice house on the shore of a spring-fed lake in the pine country of northern Wisconsin, in a township that had not cut a block of lake ice since the winter of 1961. The sawdust-insulated double walls had begun to bow. The heavy oak loading doors had been chained shut for 63 years. The Vilas County Historical Commission had delisted the building in 2015. But what nobody knew was that hidden in the cold room of that old ice house, sealed inside the double wall between the inner pine planking and the outer cedar siding, was something that hadn't been opened in over 60 years. Something that would change her life forever. Before we continue, if stories like this mean something to you, hit subscribe. And tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel. Lark Engstrom had been around ice her whole life. She was born in a small frame house on the outskirts of Eagle River, Wisconsin, the only child of a woman named Sigrid Engstrom, who had worked the front desk at a small lakeside resort for 22 years, and who had died of a brain aneurysm on a Sunday morning in March when Lark was 7. Lark's father had not been in the picture. He had been a seasonal fishing guide from Duluth who had come through Eagle River one summer and had left before Sigrid had told him she was pregnant. And Sigrid had made the same quiet decision many northern Wisconsin women of her generation had made, which was to raise the child without the man and to let the man's absence speak for itself. Lark had been raised, after her mother's death, by her mother's older sister, a woman named Astrid Engstrom, who had been the librarian at the Eagle River Public Library for 41 years, and who had taken Lark in without hesitation because Astrid had understood on the morning of Sigrid's funeral that hesitation was a luxury she could not afford, and that a 7-year-old girl standing beside a casket in a borrowed black dress was not a person you made wait while you thought about it. Astrid had been 61 when Lark came to live with her. Astrid had never married. Astrid had never had children of her own. Astrid had spent her adult life in the same small white frame house on the edge of Eagle River that her own parents had bought in 1952, and she had filled that house with books and with the specific quiet competence of a woman who had organized a small-town library by herself for 4 decades and who therefore knew how to organize anything, including a grieving 7-year-old. Astrid had done 2 things for Lark that no one else could have done. First, she had kept Lark in the same school, in the same town, on the same street where Lark had been born, so that Lark's life after her mother's death had the same geography as her life before it. Second, Astrid had kept Gustav's memory alive in the house in a way that Sigrid, who had been working double shifts at the resort 6 days a week, had not had time to do. The ice saw stayed on the wall above the fireplace. The canvas tool roll stayed on the top shelf of the hall closet. Gustav's old copy of the Ice Harvester's Handbook, a self-published pamphlet from 1934 that Gustav had annotated in pencil across 30 years, stayed on the small bookshelf beside Astrid's chair. Astrid read from it to Lark on winter evenings the way other aunts read fairy tales, because Astrid had understood that the ice harvesting stories of Vilas County were, for the Engstrom family, the closest thing to fairy tales they had. The center of Lark's education had been her grandfather, Astrid and Sigrid's father, a man named Gustav Engstrom, who had died when Lark was 5, but who had, in the 5 years of overlap between his life and hers, taught her things she would carry for the rest of her life. Gustav had been born in Eagle River in 1928, the son of Swedish immigrants who had come to the Wisconsin Northwoods in 1921 to work in the logging camps. Gustav had not become a logger. Gustav had become an iceman. He had worked as a commercial ice harvester on the lakes of Vilas County from 1946 until the trade had ended in 1961. Cutting lake ice with hand saws and horse-drawn ice plows in the winters, and storing the blocks in sawdust-insulated ice houses for summer delivery to the resorts and fish camps and small-town butcher shops of northern Wisconsin. Gustav had taken Lark out onto the frozen lake twice, once when she was 4 and once when she was 5, and had shown her how to read the color of lake ice for thickness. Clear blue-black ice was strong. White ice was weak. Gray ice was rotten and would not hold. He had let her hold the handle of an old ice saw, though she had been too small to pull it, and he had told her the names of the lakes he had cut: Catfish Lake, Cranberry Lake, Butternut Lake, Long Lake, Anvil Lake, the way certain old Scandinavian men in certain northern places told the names of the waters they had worked. Slowly, with the specific reverence of a person who had spent 15 winters on the surface of those waters with a saw in his hands and had never once fallen through. Gustav had died of a stroke at the age of 77, sitting in his favorite chair in the living room of the small white frame house, with a cup of black coffee on the table beside him and the ice saw mounted on the wall above the fireplace. Astrid had kept the ice saw on the wall. Lark had grown up looking at it every day of her childhood. The long-toothed blade and the wooden crossbar handle and the faded rope loop at the top, where Gustav had hung it from a nail in the ice house after his last season. Astrid had also kept Gustav's canvas tool roll, a heavy waxed cotton roll that held Gustav's personal set of ice tools: a scoring chisel, a small hand pick, a block tongs, a packing hook, and a set of graduated ice saws ranging from 8 inches to 3 feet. The tool roll had been on the top shelf of the hall closet of the small white frame house for Lark's entire childhood, and Astrid had given it to Lark on her 18th birthday with the instruction that the tools were not decorative and were not to be donated to a museum and were to be kept in working condition until Lark decided what to do with them. Lark had not decided what to do with them. She had graduated from Eagle River High School at 18. She had not gone to college. She had not been able to afford it and had not wanted to take on debt, a position Astrid had supported without enthusiasm because Astrid had been a librarian who believed in education, but who had also been a practical Scandinavian woman who understood that debt was debt. Lark had gotten a job at the same lakeside resort where her mother Sigrid had worked, cleaning cabins and doing small maintenance. She had been good at it. She had been good at fixing things. She had inherited Gustav's hands, calloused and patient and unafraid of cold, and she had spent 3 winters at the resort repairing dock damage and patching cabin roofs and replacing the small copper pipes that froze and burst every January in the oldest cabins. She had lived with Astrid through all of it. Astrid had been 75 when Lark graduated from high school. Astrid had been 78 when the conversation at the kitchen table happened. Astrid's health had been declining. Not dramatically, Astrid was not a dramatic woman, but in the specific accumulating way of a 78-year-old woman who had lived alone for most of her adult life, and who had begun to understand that the house was becoming harder than it needed to be. The stairs, the snow, shoveling, the furnace that needed its pilot relit every 3rd week in January. Astrid had applied to the assisted living facility in Rhinelander in October. She had been accepted in December. She had told Lark in January. "The house is going on the market at the end of the month," Astrid had said. "The realtor says it will sell quickly. I have made arrangements for you to stay with the Lindgrens. You know Helen Lindgren, she was on the library board, for up to 3 months while you figure out what to do next. I am sorry, Lark. I have loved having you here. But I cannot keep the house, and I cannot take you with me to Rhinelander because assisted living is assisted living, and it is not a place for a 21-year-old. Lark had understood. She had not argued. She had sat at the kitchen table for a long time after Astrid had gone to bed, looking at the ice saja on the wall above the fireplace and at the canvas tool roll on the top shelf of the hall closet, and she had thought about her grandfather Gustav and about the lakes he had cut and about the ice houses where the blocks had been stored. If you're enjoying this story, take a second and subscribe. It helps us keep making stories like this one. And tell us in the comments, What is a skill someone taught you before you were old enough to understand why it mattered? She had $940 in her savings account. 3 years of cabin cleaning wages, minus the small monthly contribution she had made to Astrid's grocery budget. She had Gustav's canvas tool roll. She had no car. She had been using Astrid's old Subaru Forester, which Astrid was selling with the house. She had Helen Lindgren's couch for 3 months. She moved to Helen Lindgren's house on the 1st of February. Helen was a 72-year-old retired schoolteacher who had been on the Eagle River Library Board with Astrid for 20 years, and Helen's couch was in a warm, finished basement with its own bathroom and a small window that looked out onto a snow-covered backyard. Lark was grateful. She was also, for the first time in her life, aware of the specific weight of not having a place that was hers. On a cold Wednesday evening in the 3rd week of February, Lark sat on Helen's couch with her laptop and a cup of black coffee and began looking at the Vilas County Surplus Property page. She had been looking at it off and on for about a week, not with a plan. With a feeling. The feeling had something to do with Gustav, and with the ice saw on the wall, and with the 5 lakes he had named for her when she was 4 years old, and with the specific way a person who has been raised by 2 women who lost everything, Sigrid her life, Astrid her house, begins, at 21, to look for a place that cannot be taken away. The ice house was the 4th listing on the page. A single commercial building of timber frame construction with sawdust-insulated double walls, approximately 2,400 square feet on a single story, on a 1.8-acre lakefront parcel on the north shore of Butternut Lake, 8 miles south of Eagle River. The building had been constructed in 1898 by a commercial ice harvesting cooperative called the Butternut Lake Ice Company, had operated continuously from 1898 until 1961 when the last commercial ice harvest in Vilas County had taken place, and had stood empty since. The county had taken possession in 1989 for unpaid taxes. The asking price was $10. The photograph showed a long, low building of weathered cedar siding, dark gray-brown with age, set among white pines on a gentle slope above a frozen lake. A steep metal roof. 2 tall loading doors at the lakeside end. A smaller entry door at the road end. A wooden loading ramp descending from the tall doors toward the frozen lake. Snow on the roof. Snow on the ramp. The building looked like it had been waiting for 63 years. Lark looked at the photograph for a long time. She recognized the lake. Butternut Lake. The 3rd lake Gustav had named for her. She had been 4 years old. She drove to the Vilas County Clerk's office in Eagle River the following morning in Helen Lindgren's borrowed car. The clerk was a man in his late 60s named Arlen Nyquist, who had white hair and a flannel shirt and the specific unhurried manner of a Vilas County civil servant, who had been doing the same job for 31 years. Miss Engstrom. The Butternut Lake Ice House. Yes, sir. Your grandfather was Gustav Engstrom? Yes, sir. Arlen Nyquist looked at her. Gustav Engstrom cut ice on that lake from 1946 until 1961. He was the last man to use that building. He was the man who locked the loading doors on the last day of the last harvest and hung the padlock and walked away. I know this because my own father was the cooperative's bookkeeper, and my father told me, when I was a boy, that Gustav Engstrom had been the finest iceman in Vilas County, and that he had cried, the only time my father had ever seen a Swedish man cry, on the afternoon he locked those doors. Lark said nothing. Arlen stamped the deed. He handed Lark a heavy iron key on a leather thong. This is the key your grandfather hung on the padlock in 1961. It has been in our office since 1989. Welcome home, Miss Engstrom. She drove out to Butternut Lake that afternoon. The road to the ice house was an unplowed seasonal lane that had not been maintained since the previous November, and she parked Helen's Subaru at the plowed turnaround near the county road and walked the last half-mile through knee-deep snow in her work boots, carrying Gustav's canvas tool roll over her shoulder. The ice house stood at the top of the gentle slope above the frozen lake, exactly as the photograph had shown it. Long and low, maybe 80 feet long and 30 feet wide, with weathered cedar siding gone dark gray-brown, a steep rusted metal roof, two tall oak loading doors at the lakeside end chained shut with a heavy padlock, and a smaller entry door at the road end. The loading ramp descended from the tall doors toward the frozen lake in a straight line, its planking visible under the snow. White pines surrounded the building on three sides. The frozen lake stretched out below, flat and white under the gray February sky. Lark walked to the tall loading doors. She put the iron key into the padlock. The padlock had been locked for 63 years. She worked the key for a long time. The lock turned. The chain fell. She slid the tall doors apart on their iron track. Inside, the ice house was one enormous room, the cold room, 80 feet long, 30 feet wide, 15 feet from floor to the peak of the roof. The walls were the sawdust-insulated double walls Gustav had described to her once when she was 5. An outer wall of cedar siding, then a 12-inch cavity packed with sawdust for insulation, then an inner wall of tight-fitted pine planking. The floor was heavy timber planking laid over a drainage bed of gravel and sand, with narrow drainage channels cut into the planks at regular intervals to carry meltwater toward a drain at the lower lakeside end. The ceiling was open to the rafters, massive hand-hewn pine beams, the bark still on their undersides, spanning the full 30-foot width. The cold room was empty. The last blocks of ice had melted away 63 years ago. But the room was not warm. The sawdust insulation in the double walls still worked. The temperature inside the cold room, even in February with the doors open, was noticeably colder than the air outside. A deep, still mineral cold that had nothing to do with the winter weather and everything to do with the building's original engineering. Lark walked the length of the cold room slowly. Her breath made small clouds in the still air. She ran her hand along the inner pine wall. The planking was tight-fitted, tongue and groove, the wood dark with 63 years of cold room humidity. She walked the full 80 feet and back. Near the far end of the cold room, on the north wall, about 4 feet above the floor, she noticed a section of the inner pine planking that did not match the planking around it. 3 planks in a row, maybe 2 feet wide and 3 feet tall, that had been cut shorter than the planks on either side. The cut ends had been sanded smooth and fitted flush, but the grain of the 3 short planks ran at a slightly different angle than the grain of the surrounding wall. It was the kind of difference that almost no one would notice. A carpenter would notice. A person who had grown up watching a grandfather read the grain of lake ice for thickness, clear blue-black for strong, white for weak, gray for rotten, would notice. Lark knelt in front of the 3 short planks. She ran her fingertips along the edges. The planks were not nailed. They were held in place by friction and by a thin wooden lip along the top edge. She pressed upward on the lip and pulled the 3 planks toward her. They came free as a single panel, hinged at the bottom by a strip of leather that had stiffened but not broken. Behind the panel, in the 12-inch cavity between the inner pine wall and the outer cedar wall, cleared of sawdust in a rectangular space about 2 feet wide and 3 feet tall, was a small wooden chest, hand-built, pine, with a brass hasp and a small brass padlock. Lark carried the chest out of the cold room and set it on the loading ramp in the gray February daylight. She sat down on the snow-dusted ramp beside it. The frozen lake stretched out below her. A raven called somewhere in the white pines. She opened Gustav's canvas tool roll, found the smallest ice pick, and used the pointed end to work the small brass padlock until it gave. The chest opened. Inside, laid on a folded square of waxed canvas, were 3 objects. A leather-bound book, small, thick, hand-stitched, a heavy canvas pouch tied with waxed cord, the weight of coin, and a folded letter on heavy cream paper, sealed with a small blob of pine pitch. Lark opened the book first. It was a harvest log. Every ice harvest on Butternut Lake from the winter of 1898, through the winter of 1961. 63 years of entries in the careful successive handwritings of the cooperative's ice masters. 5 men across 6 decades, each one recording the date of each harvest, the thickness of the ice, the number of blocks cut, the names of the men on the crew, the temperature of the air and the water, the condition of the saws, the weight of the blocks, and the names of the customers who had bought them. Resorts, fish camps, butcher shops, dairy farms, a hospital in Rhinelander that had taken 20 blocks a week every summer from 1912 until 1955. The last entry was dated March 8, 1961. The handwriting was careful, slanted, Swedish inflected. It read, Final Harvest. 14 inches clear blue-black. 342 blocks cut. Crew of 4, G. Engstrom, R. Lindgren, T. Matson, H. Bjork. Air temp, 12 degrees Fahrenheit. Water temp, 33 degrees Fahrenheit. This is the last commercial harvest on Butternut Lake. The resorts have all gone to electric refrigeration. I am locking the doors tonight. Gustav Engstrom, Ice Master. Lark closed the book. Her hands were very steady. She opened the canvas pouch. Inside were silver dollars. She counted them later. 87. Morgan and Peace silver dollars, dates ranging from 1898 to 1960. The silver content alone was worth about $2,000. The collector value, because of the condition and the unbroken date range, was closer to $8,200. She opened the letter. The pine pitch seal cracked away in one piece. The paper inside was heavy. The handwriting was her grandfather's. To whoever finds this chest, my name is Gustav Engstrom. I have been the ice master of the Butternut Lake Ice Company from the spring of 1946 until tonight, the 8th of March, 1961. I am 33 years old. Tomorrow I will lock the loading doors of this ice house for the last time and walk away. The trade is finished. The resorts have gone to electric refrigeration. The fish camps buy bagged ice from the filling station in Eagle River. The butcher shops in Rhinelander and Woodruff have their own cold rooms now. There is no further need for a man who cuts lake ice with a handsaw and stores it in sawdust. I have worked this ice house for 15 years. My father Niels worked it before me from 1928 until 1945. Before my father, the founding members of the cooperative, men named Lindgren and Matson and Bjork and Nyquist, worked it from 1898 until my father took over. The cooperative has operated continuously for 63 years. I am the last ice master. I am hiding this harvest log and this silver and this letter in the double wall of the cold room because I cannot bring myself to burn the log or to deposit the silver in a bank. My father did not trust banks. I do not trust them either. The log is the only complete record of 63 years of ice harvesting on Butternut Lake. Every harvest, every crew, every block. If the log is lost, the record is lost. I am leaving it in the wall because the wall is the safest place I know. The sawdust insulation keeps the cavity dry. The double wall keeps the temperature stable. A thing sealed in the wall of an ice house will last longer than a thing stored in any bank vault or county archive. The silver is what the cooperative's 4 founding families, Engstrom, Lindgren, Matson, and Bjork, have contributed to a private fund across 63 years, small amounts from each season's profits. The fund was meant to cover emergency repairs to the ice house. No emergency ever came. The fund simply grew. I am leaving it for whoever finds this chest. Use it for the building if the building still stands. Use it for yourself if the building has fallen. I do not know who will find this chest. I am 33 years old and I expect to live another 40 or 50 years, and I expect to die without ever knowing whether anyone opened the wall panel. That is all right. A man who has spent 15 winters on the surface of a frozen lake with a saw in his hands has learned to be patient with outcomes he cannot control. Read the ice clearly. Gustav Engström, Ice Master, March 8, 1961. Lark read the letter twice. Then she folded it carefully along its creases and placed it back in the chest, and she sat very still on the snow-dusted loading ramp with the frozen lake below her and the canvas tool roll beside her and her grandfather's handwriting in her lap. And she did not cry. Gustav had told her once, when she was 4 years old, that a person who works on lake ice does not cry on the ice because the salt weakens the surface, and a weakened surface is how a person falls through. Lark had been 4 when he told her that. She had not understood it at the time. She understood it now. She said aloud, to the empty ice house and to the frozen lake and to the white pines and to the raven, "Thank you, Grandpa. I will read it clearly." The rebuilding took patient months. Lark did not have much money from the silver. $8,200 once the collector in Rhinelander had appraised and purchased the coins, minus his commission, came to $7,400. She budgeted it carefully. The first major task at the ice house was not the roof, because the steep metal roof was intact. It was not the walls. The sawdust-insulated double walls were still structurally sound, still holding their original insulating properties after 63 years. The first major task was the floor. The heavy timber drainage floor had rotted in 3 places along the lower lakeside end where decades of snowmelt had seeped under the loading doors and had saturated the gravel drainage bed and the planking above it. The rotted sections had gone soft and gray, the color Gustav had taught her to recognize as rotten ice, the color that meant the surface would not hold. Floor work, pulling the rotted planks, replacing the gravel drainage bed, and laying new timber planking milled from white pine, she bought at a small sawmill in Phelps, was the first work Lark accomplished at the ice house. She did it in May and June of her first year, with Gustav's own tools from the canvas roll and with occasional advice from a 74-year-old retired carpenter named Rolf Mattsson, whose grandfather had been one of the founding members of the Butternut Lake Cooperative, and who drove out to the ice house on Saturday mornings in a battered Ford pickup to sit on a folding chair on the loading ramp and drink coffee and watch Lark work. Rolf did not charge her for his advice. Rolf had made a specific Northwoods Scandinavian decision about his part in the project. The kind of decision a man makes when he understands that the building his grandfather helped build in 1898 is being restored by the granddaughter of the man who had locked its doors in 1961, and that the best thing he can do is sit in his folding chair and answer questions when asked, and otherwise stay out of the way. By late June, the drainage floor was solid again. The new white pine planks were pale against the dark old surrounding timber, but Lark knew from Gustav's handbook that the new wood would darken within 2 winters to match the rest, and she was content to let time do its work. She converted the road-end portion of the ice house into a small insulated apartment. A cot, a wood stove she installed in the north corner, a small propane cook stove, a composting toilet behind a partition wall, a rainwater cistern fed from the metal roof. She kept the cold room intact. She kept the harvest log in a small climate-controlled case she built from reclaimed pine, displayed on a wooden stand beside the entry door. She got a job in her second year. A small environmental education nonprofit based in Eagle River, the Northwoods Ice Heritage Project, which Rolf Mattsson's granddaughter had started in 2019, hired her as a part-time educator and site interpreter. She taught school groups about the history of commercial ice harvesting in northern Wisconsin. She let children hold Gustav's ice tools. She walked groups down the loading ramp to the frozen lake in January and February and showed them how to read the color of lake ice for thickness, the way Gustav had showed her when she was 4. Astrid came to visit in Lark's second summer. Astrid was 80 by then, settled into the assisted living facility in Rhinelander, walking with a cane, but still sharp. Astrid stood in the cold room of the ice house for a long time without speaking. Then she said, "Your grandfather locked these doors on the last day of the last harvest and cried. My father told me. It was the only time he had ever cried. I always wondered what he left behind. She looked at the harvest log in its case. She read the last entry, final harvest. 14 inches clear blue-black, 342 blocks cut. And she said, "Gustav, you old Swede, you sealed it in the wall." Lark said, "He sealed it in the wall, Aunt Astrid." On a clear evening in late September of her 25th year, Lark sat on the loading ramp of the ice house and watched the last copper light fade across Butternut Lake. The lake was still liquid, it would not freeze until late November, and the water was turning the deep cold blue that the Northwoods lakes turn at sunset in September, when the summer is gone, and the birches along the shore are beginning to go gold. A loon called somewhere out on the water. The white pines above the ice house caught the last light on their highest branches. She thought about her grandfather Gustav, who had cut ice on this lake for 15 years and had locked the loading doors on the last day of the last harvest, and had cried. She thought about her mother Sigrid, who had died on a Sunday morning in March when Lark was 7 and who had never known that her own father's harvest log and silver and letter had been sealed inside the wall of a building 8 miles from the house where she had grown up. She thought about Astrid, who had taken a 7-year-old girl in without hesitation and had raised her for 14 years in a small white frame house with an ice saw on the wall and a canvas tool roll on the top shelf of the hall closet, and who had given those tools to Lark on her 18th birthday with the instruction that they were not decorative. That's the thing about the tools our grandfathers leave us. We do not always know. When we are 4 years old and standing on a frozen lake, holding the handle of a saw we are too small to pull, that the saw is not the point. The point is the hand that guides us to the handle. The point is the voice that says, "Clear blue-black is strong, white is weak, gray is rotten." We carry the lesson inside us for 17 more years without understanding what it is for. And then, one cold February afternoon, we kneel in front of a pine wall in an empty cold room, and we see 3 planks whose grain runs at a slightly different angle than the planks around them, and we understand, finally, what our grandfather was teaching us on the lake that morning. He was teaching us to read the difference between what holds and what does not. He was teaching us to notice. Lark Engstrom was 21 years old and thrown out. She had $10 to her name, and she spent it on a crumbling commercial ice house on the shore of a spring-fed lake in the pine country of northern Wisconsin. It was the best $10 she ever spent. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you loved it, we have something special for you. 12 brand new stories, never released on YouTube, only available to the people who support this channel directly. Each one a full Quiet Road story, just like this one. You will find the link in the description. We poured our whole hearts into these, and we made them for the people who truly listen. Thank you for being one of them. See you on the next Quiet Road.